I have about 4 hours worth of notes to squeeze into this 1 hour, and I've just been sitting here trying to hold it all together. It reminds me of my old, I worked for some years in our family business selling wooden barrels, and I remember that the brandy barrels had to have extra hoops on because the internal pressure was so great that you had to put 2 extra hoops, and I feel just like a brandy barrel now. I don't quite know where to start. I've got 8 different pages here. And I think it doesn't matter very much. I was telling my wife that one time, 6 or 8 months ago, I had to speak before an audience, and as I took my notes out, found they were the wrong notes. There I was in front of 1,000 or so people, and it turned out to be very, very pleasant because it was like taking the hoops off the brandy barrel. What I have here is let me try this trick that I learned during the summer at the tea group in Bethel. When you're really in a conflict, you don't quite know what to do. A standard procedure is to say, let me share my dilemma with you. What we have, this is the dilemma, what we have is increasingly clearly the development of a comprehensive philosophy, something that covers everything. It's a Weltanschauung is the good German word, a world view, a view of life, and I've been writing down lists of things that are covered, that are encompassed within this philosophical revolution, I guess you'd have to call it, using the word philosophy, to cover all branches of knowledge. Well, where do you start? I suppose the truth is you can start any place because this is a comprehensive system, and one starting point is just as good as another. Part of the dilemma came to me in visual images. One that I was thinking of as I made these notes here was that it was a little like my apple tree, that it's like apples popping in. They all come ripe at about the same time. And this is what's been happening. This is the way of saying what I'd like to say, is that approximately the same kind of thing has been happening in every area of human life. What I was aware of as a psychologist, the revolution developing within psychology, was a simultaneous development within that field of something similar going on in every other field. And then again you get the German word, the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. And that spirit of the time shows itself everywhere I look, and probably any places I haven't looked yet. This is a general revolution, I think it's fair to say. In each of the fields of knowledge, in each of our social institutions, that these goings on have been by people unknown to each other, as I keep discovering every week or 2 or 3, some part of this, some, how shall I say, precipitation of this zeitgeist in some area that I've turned to for the first time, and then I find something is happening there, which could also be called humanistic, perhaps, which seems to be the word that I think we're falling into the habit of speaking now about humanistic psychologists and humanistic economists and humanistic anthropologists and so on. And then this is confusing itself. And I sweated over these notes trying to make some kind of order, some sensible way of describing that if you talk about this broad front change in philosophy, that at the very same time that that's happening, if you'd call this, let's say, the humanistic revolution, the turn back to human needs, essentially, as the center of knowledge and the center of concern, that if you call this the humanistic philosophy, at the before this darn thing has really got organized itself, from within its own bowels is emerging yet the next step. And we are already speaking of the transhumanistic. And it's very hard to describe that. It's a little like an unborn embryo becoming pregnant. I don't know how else to say it. And then what do you do about it? How can you organize that? It's like catching something en passant. It's developing very, very rapidly. We have the time dimension. It doesn't stand still long enough for us to get orderly and organized and to have a really good, solid professor-type lecture with point 1, point 2, point 3, and then sub-point A, sub-point A, and so that you can have nice notes at the end of an hour. I don't know what kind of notes you could have at the end of this hour, but let me try. Supposing now, without trying so desperately as I've been doing, I've got very wound up about this, trying to be academic about it, orderly, I should say, but without giving up the effort to separate this humanistic from the transhumanistic. And speaking of them both perhaps as the third psychology, that's within the sphere of psychology we've been talking about third force or third stream, or the third psychology. And what I just spoke about as transhumanistic psychology could properly be called a fourth psychology even. Supposing I give up the effort, give up this conflict of trying to separate them out from each other and speak of them together. Now, if I had to define this, what I consider most, if I were asked what was most important in this broad revolution, I've been thinking very hard about this and trying to boil it down, and I think it boils down to just these few points. First of all, it's a centering of knowledge, of epistemology, of metaphysics, of science, and of all human concerns on human needs and on human experience. Now, that sounds, I'm sure that sounds very obvious and unbreathtaking to most of you. Maybe it's because you don't know enough to get confused. The professionals have been working, if you were to read the history of philosophy, let's say, or the history of psychology, and if you really got wound up in it, got soaked in it, you'd find that this is in fact a new departure. That this, in one sense, is a departure from the classical German intellectual style of moving from the abstract and the a priori and deriving everything from that, and having the kind of the Leibniz and that would be a good example of or the Kantian kind of structure, where a professor figures everything out, and it's all in big words, abstract words, and with the lesser German professors, commonly you could call them helium-filled words. They have no connection with the earth, particularly. And this, I know how to say it. This is what Kierkegaard and Nietzsche revolted against. This was the turn back from system in the old German style, from abstractions, from a prioris, from big notions that were figured out, from which reality, so to speak, was derived. Now, what we're doing, partly following the phenomenologists and the existentialists, what we're doing now, and what I'm saying now, that the humanistic psychology is doing, is coming back to the prime reality, which is human experience itself, and starting from there, and then deriving the concepts, the abstractions, the definitions, from this base of real human experience, and also of human needs, human values, human goals. Now, this contrasts in another way. If I make it within psychology, I think any of you who are workers in other intellectual fields can very easily parallel what I'm saying. Now, within psychology, the great psychologies were the behavioristic, the objectivistic, the positivistic, which essentially can be described as modeling itself upon the successful sciences, which have been physics and chemistry and astronomy and geology and so on, generally the science of things, the science of objects. Some people have called it mechanomorphic. And the rationale there is, look how physics is the most successful science, and the best thing we can do is to emulate our predecessors and do it in the same way. And it is possible. There is certainly a large literature. I won't call it, well, it's sort of anemic, but it's certainly large. A great deal of information that has been obtained by the psychologists approaching the human being, studying the human being as if he were an object, as if he were a thing. That is, with the same procedures, the same methods, the same concepts, the same definitions, the same attitudes that you would have for studying, let's say, the nature of a metal, perhaps. Well, you would say this is the mechanomorphic. The second psychology is Freudian, and with a penumbra of all kinds of modifications around it. And this, I think, again, oversimply, we could identify with the second great step in science, I think, the Darwinian revolution. And this is, if you'll permit me to say it very, very briefly and very succinctly, this is the treating the study of the phyletic scale and the evolutionary scale, and the tendency to then to treat the human being as if he were an animal, which of course he is, but as if he were merely an animal, only an animal, so that the animal characteristics which the human species has, which no other species has, these are not considered somehow scientific questions. And the only things that tend to get studied by those psychologists who model themselves on the life sciences. Freud himself had a training in neurology and comparative anatomy and so on. That frequently what it comes down to is that that is scientific about, that can be studied scientifically about the human being, which he has in common with lower animals. Somehow, if he does not have it in common with lower animals, then it doesn't count, or it's not to be studied, or it's not scientific. And Freud had something of the sort. Let's say the peculiarly human qualities, what we might call the higher qualities. The lower qualities we share with other animals. The higher qualities that are unique to the human beings, these higher qualities, these higher aspirations, higher values, are what Freud then had to feel reductive about. That is, it's quite rare to find, let's say, altruism or kindness. You find it in some animals, some infra-human animals, but it's in a very rudimentary form. This is especially human. The Freudian tendency, at least the Freudian tendency as written down, no good clinician, of course, does this in his actual practice, but as written down systematically, the tendency for Freud was to reduce it, to make an animal explanation of it somehow, or a pessimistic explanation, or as in my own notes someplace, I have a file called proctopsychology, following the medical specialty of proctology, which is the study of the rectum, the anus, and so on, it's perfectly true that this is an entrance to the human body, and it's one way of approaching the subject, but, but to say the least, there are other ways. I would say that a second big point here in the humanistic psychology is that these human needs which I spoke about are what we can fairly call higher needs. And furthermore, these higher needs are biologically based. They're part of the human essence, I would say, part of the species character. I invented a word for it which I thought was very good. I like it, but I get knocked on the head by my colleagues for it. It's called instinctoid, meaning it's not an instinct, but it's instinct-like in the sense of being genic, to an appreciable extent determined by, by genes. Now, these higher human needs are therefore biological. I speak here of love, the need for love, for friendship, for dignity, for self-respect, for individuality, for self-fulfillment, and so on. These needs, let's say, though there's not really final clinching evidence, you cannot say that this has been very, very finally demonstrated, but there's certainly a very considerable amount of evidence to make this a very plausible, reasonable hypothesis. That's especially true for the love needs. There, by the way, I should say that it is quite well and certainly supported. It's as if you might say that this is like saying something about higher feelings for human nature. It's a way of saying that perhaps human nature has through history been sold short, that the higher possibilities or the conception of the human being as needing and wanting dignity biologically, and therefore one could say as having a right to it. One might consider this one of the fundamental human rights, because it's in the same sense that it's a human right to have enough calcium and vitamins and cod liver oil and so on. In that sense, that this also can be called a human right. It's part of human nature. If these needs are not fulfilled, then we know very well at the clinical level, pathology results. People get sick. They get sick in all kinds of ways. Some of these ways perhaps I'll have time to describe, these new pathologies that come from selling human nature short, as you might say. Now, out of this womb, you might say, no, let me say it in another way. Supposing we take the people who have been gratified in these higher human needs, the fortunate ones, who do exist, by the way. These are not figments of the imagination. You can find them. They do exist. People who have been satisfied in these basic needs, people who do feel loved and who are able to love, and who do feel safe and secure, and who do feel respected, and who do have self-respect. Then if you take such people, and if you study them, and if you ask what motivates them, then you find yourself in another realm altogether. And here I think I would have to start talking about transhumanistic. That is, meaning that the motivations of that which moves, that which gratifies, that which pays the fortunate and developed and psychologically healthy and basic need fulfilled person, the self-actualizing person is one name for it, that if you ask what motivates these people, then the answer that I've been finding is that these people are now motivated by something beyond the basic needs, and these are the intrinsic values of various sorts. I'd find it very difficult to squeeze that into a minute or two. But I think, let me say this simply as a reference. There's a great deal of information which is now available on fortunate people working under the best conditions and choosing their own lives, and then responding. The question that I used as I investigated, the one question that turned out to be most important and most fruitful was to ask at first, these were creative scientists, very, very good scientists, I asked them the question, which are the moments in which you get the greatest kicks, the greatest satisfactions? What do you live for? Why is it that you'll clean these darn test tubes for 3 years, you'll work and sweat and so on? Most jobs are mostly dishwashing and chores and cleaning up the floor and so on. Practically any job you can think of is mostly sweat. What are the great moments? What are the moments of reward which make all this sweating and cleaning worthwhile? Now, the answers to those questions were in terms of ultimate human verities, of people reporting one way or another. And this is going to be published, by the way, in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. The editor is here, so we should put in a plug for it. Next number of the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. There's a detailed account of the way in which, with tables and lists of the kinds of answers that you get to such questions, and with some demonstration of how it is reasonable to call these the ultimate values, or the values of being, or what I call for short, the B values, or what Bob Hartman has called the intrinsic values: truth and goodness and beauty and perfection and excellence and simplicity, elegance, and so on and so on. Now, what this amounts to is that this third psychology is giving rise now to a fourth transhumanistic psychology and dealing with transcendent experiences and with transcendent values, transcendent in the sense of what I've been saying there is that the fully developed and the very fortunate human being working under the best conditions tends to be motivated by values which transcend his self. That is, they are not selfish anymore in the old sense. They are now perhaps selfish, if you want to use the word, in a new sense, a higher sense. Perhaps we could say a transcendent sense. Beauty, after all, is not within one's skin. Justice or order or lawfulness is, I could hardly say that this is selfish in the same sense that my greed for food might be, which nourishes my self. But my need for, my satisfaction in justice is not within my own skin, and it doesn't lie along my arteries. It's equally outside as inside. And therefore it has transcended the geographical limitations of the self. And so you can it makes a certain sense there to talk about transhumanistic psychology. One thing that this means, which is especially important, is that it implies, see, I've been talking about values here, and I claim to be talking about values. If I had wanted to, I could have kept on my cap and gown and spoken as a scientist. I claim to be speaking as a scientist. A scientist out exploring the wilderness, it's true, not the main traveled roads, but yet this is empirical stuff. And what I have just been saying is something which can be confirmed or disconfirmed by anybody sitting here who wants to go to the trouble. It's up for grabs, so to speak. It can be checked. It can be either verified or falsified, one or the other. And this is clearly within the jurisdiction of, this is a scientific statement, I would say. Now, what I have done there has been to deny the whole modern history of science, which has, from its very beginnings, claimed and needed to be, as a matter of fact, value-free, value-neutral, value-rejecting. If you'll remember that science started that way, cleaning the churches, cleaning the values which were purported to be revealed to particular priests or to the nobility or to the higher classes or to whoever, that these values were, and wishes and desires were removed from the universe by the original astronomers and students of mechanics and of physics in general and of geology and so on, and very rightly so. The truth is that the world of objects and of things is in this sense certainly value-free. But I would remind you that human beings are not value-free. That they live by values, they live for values. This is the validation of life itself, as can be found out. And so that what we have here is a rejection of the model of mechanomorphic science, that is a value-free science. And this is also a rejection then of the tendency to technologize, that is to make all the applied sciences, meaning all the professions, as I see it, there's a very powerful tendency to technologize education and nursing and social work and everything else I can think of practically, as people become experts and say to non-experts, don't you interfere with this is not your business, that this can be described, perhaps I'll have time to do it, can be described as technologizing the professions in the sense of making them, or of trying to make them value-free, of trying to make them simply technique, to be efficient, to do it well. But don't ask the question about what it is that you're supposed to do well. In my school of social work on my campus, it's kind of the West Point of social work, I guess. They give the PhDs in social work, which I think that means you have the right to wear two caps and gowns if you want to. And everybody's busy running around there working at doing things better, being more efficient, more capable, more expert, but they don't have a social philosopher in the place. And every time I have raised the question with my friends in the school about what is the good society, everybody looks embarrassed. I think again of the marvelous thing which I've quoted and several times, I think, because I like it well. It's very meaningful about this true story which I was told about the test pilot who radioed back, I'm lost, but I'm making record time. Another thing, what shall I call it, characteristic of this new third and fourth, humanistic and transhumanistic development that's going on, which comes out of, which emerges and is generated by some of the things I've talked about, is a re-sacralizing, a re-spiritualizing. The value-free science is a desacralizer. That is, it makes things natural and positivistic. It takes in what can be taken in. Those are data which are available to the senses. This would be a simple definition of positivism. And we have something new if you open the door to values and to the value experiences and to the peak experiences, which I'd like to say something about. Then you have opened the door since the peak experiences, in the first place, since these experiences happen, nobody has denied this. I mean, they do happen. They can be described. I even just for show-off purposes did some experiments with a computer. It's possible to make tables and correlations and so on. There's a kind of a technology of peak experiences, if you want. That's a nice technology, however. If you accept this as part of the natural world, and remember we have already accepted human experience as part of the natural world, human experience as data, respectable data, then you find that there are many, the reports from people in peak experiences parallel very frequently the reports of the great mystics, of the religious mystics, for instance. And they talk about the unitive consciousness, for instance. Or, as also the Zen Buddhists do, speak of the eternal in the temporal. They use many words which, for value-free science, have been excluded from the jurisdiction of science and have been turned over to, let's say, the professional religious people, the poets, the dramatists, the novelists, and so on, and have been excluded as not scientific, meaning, without it being said, meaning not really knowledge. These are emotions, perhaps, or wishes, or desires, but they're not really fact. They're not really emotions. Well, one thing that has to be said about a technical thing here that has to be said, because there's the possibilities of great confusion here, as I know very well because I've gone through the confusions, that what this has, let me put it this way, what this has developed out of has been a value orientation to start with. That is, of selecting out people who were, the self-actualizing people that I talked about were very healthy people. Psychiatrically, psychologically healthy people. Now you could say superior if you wanted to, or as I've studied, very creative people, very talented people, and more recently, very strong, powerful characters. That this is already a selection out of the population. In a certain sense, I and others have been studying not really the whole human species in the ordinary statistical sense, not the average of the species, not a good sampling at all, but a very special sampling, a sampling really of, let's say, the best 1 in 100. Best meaning in these various, in creativeness perhaps, or in intelligence perhaps, or in talent, or in strength, or whatever. Now, this is a kind of statistical approach, and it's a very peculiar one. It's a very unusual one. I've learned to call it growing tip statistics, following the biologists who, if you remember, for instance, your botany, you remember about the growing tip, that this was where all the action takes place, all the chromosomes dividing like mad, where in the rest of the, let's say, the tree trunk, the chromosomes they're very stable. They're not dividing. They're doing nothing. The woody part of the trunk of a tree is it's not really active in the same sense that the growing tip is, let's say on your evergreens, where it even has a different color of green. If you examine that under the microscope, you'll find that that's where the growth takes place. That's where the action is. And this is, in a certain sense, what I've done as a technique is pulling out what you might call the best specimens, rather than of studying the whole of the population. Now, this, I think I can justify this in various ways, quite apart from all the startling things we've learned from this technique, but in the sense that, for instance, the Olympic gold medal winners, let's say, represent the limits of human potential for every new baby that's born into the world. Because when I was a youngster and trying to run on the track team, then 100 yards, it was humanly impossible to run 100 yards in less than 10 seconds, and it was humanly impossible to run a mile in less than, I forget the numbers now. But in each of these events, what was humanly impossible has become possible because it was demonstrated. Somebody did it. And each time that someone did it, the potentials, the horizons, the ceilings for every newborn baby lifted. In a certain sense, these are the potentials for all human beings. You can pick the Olympic athletes, if you like, and that's about what I've been doing. This is a technique for selecting out the most fully evolved, the most fully developed, a word that I think is fair, the most fully human, even in the statistical sense, and then saying that this is what, in principle, what the whole human species can be like if you just let them grow, if the conditions are good, and if you get out of their way. This is definitely not an average sample. It's a growing tip sample, or the best of 1%. Also, from study of such people came certainly my great absorption, now the absorption of many other people with these peak experiences, with these great mystical experiences, which had been thought to be quite rare, but which we now know are not rare, and furthermore, which are quantified. There are great ones and middle-sized ones and little ones, and you can talk about peak, that's P-E-A-K, by the way. You can talk about peak experiences. You could also talk about foothill experiences, for instance. Or following that, as a recent finding, that the older people, as the peak experiences in the great big emotional ecstasies tend to get less in number, and you're apt to see more of what can be called, following the same paradigm there, a plateau, high plateau experience, a sort of a serene cognition of being, you might call it, a quiet cognition of heaven. So I remember once called it sort of being lounging in heaven. You're not getting all excited about it. Now, I made a list here of that I'd like to turn to pass on some of the sense that I have of this revolution along the total front that's going on. This revolution that I've been talking about here, this third and fourth revolution. What does this mean for these various fields? Now, I think I have time for, let's say, a word or two about each of them. First of all, we're dealing with a new image of man. Now, I think that's most important because from that everything else flows. All of man's works, all of man's institutions, and that, by the way, includes science, and it includes all the sciences. Mathematics and physics are also human institutions. They are generated by human nature. They're made possible by human nature. The only scientists I've ever known were members of the human species, human beings. The image of man generates everything else we're going to talk about. And this image of man is as I've already said, it's taller. There are more possibilities in it. The ceilings are higher. The potentials are greater. We can expect more by way of possibility from these people. Secondly, second only on my list, which is arbitrary, the interpersonal relations. Out of this has come certainly already a greater conception of human love. That is, there's a hierarchy of loves, you might say. And love at the highest level that I've described it at anyhow, love for the being of the other person rather than mutual customer satisfaction, so to speak, that this love, this be-love, if you'll permit me that abbreviation, this be-love is a higher conception of what is possible in the human being. Not necessarily what exists in large quantities, but what is possible, what is the human potential. This is also true for sex. We have now, again, this has given us a notion of higher ceilings for sexuality, especially in the love relationship, that sex can be seen at its highest levels, the most fortunate levels, as a trigger for peak experiences, for mystical experiences. You say it very bluntly as one of the gates to heaven. This is possible, although not at all common. Not really common at all. Well, this itself opens up a realm for science to explore, because as we find, if you actually examine the sexual lives of actual people, and if you take a real sampling of the population, you find that 99% of the population don't really know what the possibilities of sexuality are. That is, they don't know how high the ceilings can be. And this is a realm for empirical work, for investigation. You can do researches with this. This is, I think, true. One thing I've got interested in only recently is as it dawned upon me and some of my friends, although now in retrospect I can see that we've talked about it a great deal, that the conception of friendship is also hierarchical, and that there are higher levels of friendship which are possible. And then as you study what friendship can be, rarely, what it can be, what it might be under the best circumstances, then it throws into very cruel and cold relief what friendships actually are. And they're not very much by contrast with what they can be. Well, this opens up again, if you become conscious of it, because of these higher ceilings, that is because of this way of looking for a higher level, and you can get the vision there of a higher kind of authentic friendship, and then you turn around and look and see that it's missing. This can spur you on again to research, to therapeutic work perhaps, to trying to make it come to pass as you get this vision. This is true for the family. It's true for the teacher-child relationship. We have, I should say, higher conceptions being developed, being generated out of the humanistic and the transhumanistic psychology. One great thing, which is perhaps I ought to separate from the image of man, the new image of society, and especially of the relationship between man and society. At the lower levels of, let's say at the second level, by contrast with its third and fourth level, society, civilization is seen, and its interests are seen as in necessary mutual exclusive contrast with the interests of the individual. What is good for the individual is bad for civilization. That is, if he were selfish, if he let himself go, if he were impulsive and so on, if he didn't control himself, then civilization would fall. This is the Freudian conception, for instance. There is, following Ruth Benedict, one of the great anthropologists, a new conception of a higher possibility of, if I could say it briefly, the healthy society. It's possible, there are tools now available for judging societies from outside the society. And that's of course, the death of cultural relativity is a total philosophy of anthropology. One society can be judged to be better than another society, or healthier, or in terms of suitability for, let's say, one of the words we're using now, growth fostering. One society is more growth fostering than another, we could say. Or we can talk about, as we talk here, about the value of a society or the function of a society, that is, for the greatest self-actualization, the greatest coming to fulfillment of the people in the society. That's a value. And we know something about it. This is generating a different notion of reality, most peculiarly, of objectivity. It turns out there's kind of a higher conception of objectivity than the one that we know. I can't resist taking one moment at least to talk about it. I'm going to run over time. Maybe I will spend that 4 hours after all that I have notes for. If the notion of objectivity that the scientist now has is what you might call the spectator objectivity, of not caring, that is, being neutral about the matter, of it doesn't matter to him who wins and who loses, so to speak. Well, we have something emerging from the study of the be-love relationship, where you can have love for the problem. It's not necessarily only for a human being. It's possible to have love enough for a human being, for your child, for instance. If you have great love for your child, it's possible to leave him alone. It's a great achievement. And it's possible to leave him alone in the Taoistic sense because you love him so much the way he is that you just delight in watching him grow. This can be said for apple trees too, or for animals, or for whatever. It turns out that it's possible that let me put it this way, via loving at a very high level, it is possible to become objective, detached, non-intrusive, non-interfering, able to leave it alone, so that you can let it be itself. And it begins to appear that in such a spirit, from such a spirit comes the greatest perspicuity, the greatest accuracy of perception. Because the opposite, leaving it alone perception, is our normal perception of can I make use of it? Is it good for me? Is it bad for me? Can I profit from it? Is it threatening to me? Is it dangerous to me? Can I eat it? And so on. And this means always necessarily seeing in an abstract way. It means not seeing the whole of the thing. It means seeing only, let's say, whether it's edible or not edible, which means seeing only part of it, which means, therefore, seeing inaccurately. Permitting yourself to see the whole of it, therefore, would be seeing it more accurately. And this is, though at first it sounds like a paradox, I don't think it is really. Perhaps a word about religion, considering the locale. And let this serve for many of the things that I could say about the professionalizing. It seems to me that if you focus upon the religious experience, or better said, if you, as happens in fact to me, focusing upon the peak experience, and then finding the peak experience to have almost all of the characteristics traditionally attributed to religious experiences, so that I got to think of these as small r religious experience, universal religious experience, not having anything to do necessarily with one creed or another or one place or another, then it turns out that if this is so, that we have paradoxes again. One can talk of the religionizing, you might say, or the sacralizing of all of life. Now that would mean a contradiction to what actually happens. The religious day is Sunday. The other days you don't have to have these feelings at all. Or characteristically, there are holy places, or places in which when you walk in the door, then you're supposed to feel the religious feeling, and you have that religious feeling till you walk out the door, and then you drop it, and you needn't have religious feeling anymore. The contrast with that expertizing, you might say, or specializing the day, the building, the person, the moment, that the contrast is then with the religionizing or the spiritualizing of all of life. Presumably, as a matter of fact, empirically I can report that these peak experiences can take place any place, or at any time, and to anyone. Now, this can be said for education, that humanistic education, I think it could be demonstrated if we had the time, humanistic education means educationalizing the whole of life rather than having education take place in one kind of building, not outside, and of having one kind of person specialized as a teacher. If this New York City teachers' strike lasts long enough, we may learn a great deal about real education. The mothers and neighborhood people and all sorts of non-experts are coming into school. There are no examinations being given, no grades. There may really be a great step forward there as a possibility. I don't count on it because I suspect that the experts will get things well in hand again. And we'll start throwing education again into 3-credit slices, like the slices of a tangerine. Somehow they all turn out to be equal and to fall apart and to be separate from each other. Do you get the picture there? I could go on with it. What I'm trying to say is that all of life can be educationalized, all of life can be religionized, if you think in terms of the ultimate values, rather than of the expertness, rather than of the technology, rather than of the expertise, rather than of the specialties. All of life can be and should be aestheticized. I know this was a great illumination for me when it dawned on me, that you can make life itself into an artistic product. You can make your home into an artistic product. You can I was in a home last night in which was an artistic, everything was beautiful. And this is quite different from our way of only artists, certified artists, preferably with a diploma from someplace, and who have a studio and who say, I am an artist. And then they do particular things on canvas, for instance, that's all right. With your wallpaper at home, that's not art. That's something else. Or with fabrics or whatever, this would be different. And there again you have a technologizing even of beauty, a separation off of the experts, and the humanistic contrast there is with the aestheticizing of all of life. The same thing is true of the therapeutic experience and the personal growth fostering, that therapy can fill all of life also. All of life can be, or any part of life can be sacralized. All of life can be philosophized. As a matter of fact, there's a good example. The professors of philosophy have not been, most of the history of philosophy comes from non-professors of philosophy. Professors of philosophy, many of them, a very large proportion of them, are those who make commentaries upon the actual philosophizing, which have been done by a lens maker, grinder, and by people who had other titles altogether, like, let's say, like Freud, a psychiatrist, and so on. Let me say last, in my capacity as a scientist, and of trying to make it clear that I'm speaking. No, let me back up and take it from another angle. Let me talk to the point of, is this optimistic? Now, the answer there is that it's neither optimistic nor pessimistic, that our job as empirical people is to be realistic, to be good reporters, good observers. What is actually the case? Now, in this instance, I know that the people who, many of the humanistic psychologists, for instance, are called neo-Rousseauists, or that they believe in inevitable progress, or one recent, who was it who accused this group of believing that man can become perfect, and accused them also of denying the possibility of evil. That, let me say that all of these possibilities that I have been talking about are in fact possibilities. These are possibilities which have been described in about, let's say, a fraction of 1% of the population. It would be possible to talk about the healthiest 1% or the most creative 1%. This is a realistic statement. It's a statement of the realistic or empirical in the sense, first of all, that everything that has been said here can be confirmed or disconfirmed, verified or falsified. It can be put to the test. Secondly, it's possible for each of these statements to talk in statistical terms, that is, in arithmetical terms, talk about the degree of reliability. How reliable is this? How sure are we that this is so? What does it mean about this growing tip statistics that I spoke about? Now, will this actually happen? This also is an accusation against the humanistic psychologists and the humanistic sociologists and so on, that they are assuming that this must inevitably come about. The answer is, so far as I can make out, no, it's not necessary that it should come about. This whole darn place might be wiped out. The atom bombs are still sitting around and waiting. It's possible that they might win. But it's also possible that they might not win. It's possible that this, if we get the scientific vision, that is the empirical vision of something which is in truth a human potential and which therefore can conceivably be actualized, that these are all not pipe dreams but clear possibilities, then this brings it well within the realm of human activity. I think what I'd like to wind up with is that what this, certainly what this means to me anyhow, is the possibility of hope. That is, this has to be said. It wouldn't have had to be said 20 or 30 years ago, but in this day, when there's so much despair and anguish and death wish and people giving up and people saying you can't improve anything and the only thing you can do is to protest, and that it's no use trying to improve the society, it's no use trying to improve people, it's no use trying to improve anything, that I would say that everything that I have been talking about and all the data, piles of it, upon which those statements are based, deny the necessity of anguish, despair, giving up, of hopelessness, and do leave the possibility of hope in the sense of, if you work hard, perhaps you can bring these things about.
10-minute break.